PASS Business Analytics Virtual Chapter. My name is Melissa Debsack, and I lead this chapter along with Parish Doshi, who helps out with marketing and getting the word out about the group. Most recently, we added a YouTube channel for the PASS Business Analytics Virtual Chapter, and we're trying to put as many meetings up there as possible. There's times when the quality isn't as great, so we're not putting them out there. But make sure you go and subscribe to that channel out on YouTube. Alrighty. If you don't know about it already, the PASS Business Analytics Conference is coming up in May. They just announced a top-notch speaker who's about his tagline is "Information is Beautiful," I believe. He's been on a lot of TED Talks and so forth, so they've really got some big headliners for the conference. So, you know, don't wait to sign up. I don't think it'll get sold out, but you never know. And if you do sign up and you haven't already, we do have a discount code for the chapter, BAVC04, and I'll put that out on the chat window when I get a chance. If we get registrations, we get some complimentary giveaways for the chapter. So please use our code if you plan on signing up. Alrighty, we really have a full lineup of speakers coming up. Microsoft is actually speaking next Thursday on SQL Server 2014 and their countdown and enabling business intelligence. So I'm really excited to have them. I guess PASS is going to be hosting a bunch of basically 2014 launch or countdown events. So this will be the first one. I haven't even been told who the exact speaker is. So that should be interesting. Watch that in the coming week. Also thought that in the spirit of Power BI, it would be great to have a session on how to configure Power BI in Office 365, how to procure your tenant and set things up. So Patrick LeBlanc from Microsoft Learning, he'll be coming to join us on March 6th. And then on March 27th, Chris Webb, who was one of the finalists in the Power BI contest, he's going to actually be taking us step-by-step through his analyzing road traffic accident data in Power BI. I thought that would be great as a real-time, real example to bring us through and show us how he actually did that. Got some more topics that I'm working on, which include data visualization concepts. I also want to get in a talk on data mining. But as always, if you guys have any kind of suggestions for topics that you'd like to see, just shoot us an email and we'll try to find someone to speak. So that is all I have. Kevin, are you ready for me to pass the meeting on to you?
Sure can. First of all, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine. Now, Kevin, he's been presenting. This is like the third time you've been presenting for us?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, so he's been a great add to the program, and I'm really looking forward to his talk today on KPIs, and I'll let him do more of the introduction on himself. Thank you for joining us, Kevin.
Okay, thank you. And first of all, I'm sharing my screen. Can you see my screen okay?
I can.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, we're ready to roll then.
Oh, Kevin, do you want questions as we go along, or do you want them saved to the end?
Saved at the end is actually the best way, if that's okay with everyone.
Okay. Okay, so don't hesitate to ask questions. At the end, I'll do a roll call of them and ask them back to Kevin. So, alrighty.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining. My name is Kevin Goff, and today we're going to talk about building key performance indicators and the way KPIs are used in the SQL Server BI stack. Now, a little bit about me. First of all, I've been writing articles and doing webcasts for quite some time using the brand name of the Baker's Dozen, where I present 13 different productivity tips, and in more recent times have been doing a lot of webcasts presenting 13 tips, and so my website is basically called bdbiradio.com. I'm actually an old radio fan from the older days, and so use that sort of as the theme. And today's broadcast is going to be on 13 tips for building KPIs. And Melissa, I'm getting all of a sudden I'm getting some echo feedback that I wasn't getting before. Don't know if it's from me or from. I'll keep talking and let me see if it goes away. Okay, looks like it subsided. So, okay, we'll get to the topics here in just a second. Again, my name is Kevin Goff. My website, the only thing you need to write down here is www.kevinsgoff.net. The webcast, actually, it's still part of my same site. It's called bdbiradio.com. And actually, if I just click on that link to go up here and just take a quick look at them. Did a webcast a couple weeks ago on 13 tips for change data capture in SQL Server. Got more planned throughout the year. If I go back to 2013, here's some webcasts I did last year on things like 13 differences between SSAS Tabular and SSAS OLAP, or 13 tips for data warehousing, 13 features of the SQL Server 2012 column store index. So feel free to go up to the site and check out any of the videos or any of the slide decks. So today's topic is going to be 13 tips for working with and building key performance indicators with the SQL Server BI stack. Now, KPIs really reflect where the business intersects with the technical architecture. KPIs are a critical analytic piece for many data warehouses, analytic databases, to some of the important executives in a company. They can be the reason for a data warehouse. We think of everything that we need to do to build a data warehouse or an analytic system, but to some corporate users, when they sign on to a scorecard every Monday morning or every day or however often, and they take a look at performance metrics and they see visualizations of what metrics are important to them, that's their reason for the system. So these are obviously very important topics. Now, this presentation is going to be a little bit of background on the concept of KPIs. So depending upon, for the attendees, depending upon how much you've done with KPIs, some of this might be a little bit of a review, although sometimes it never hurts to go back over the fundamentals. So I'm going to take a look at some of the background of the concept of KPIs, sort of independent of any technology, and then examples for creating and consuming these with the Microsoft BI tools. As it turns out, you've got a lot of different options for utilizing KPIs in everything from Excel to reporting services to web dashboards created with things like performance point services. And so we get a lot of different options, but anytime we have different options, we have different features that we need to be aware of. So I'm going to cover several of those here today. Now, the topics we're going to look at, the 13 topics for today in the spirit of the Baker's Dozen. First three topics here in white are sort of a background of what are KPIs, what isn't a KPI, and I'll explain in a minute why I have that bullet point there. I'm going to take a look at the concept of balanced scorecards, and I'm going to talk about the components of a KPI. Then we're going to get into various examples of building a reporting services report with KPI-like functionality. Sometimes you might have output in an application that might not formally be a KPI structure, but has sort of KPI capabilities to it. Well, in points 5 through 9, really the core of the technical presentation here, we're going to look at building KPIs using analysis services with both OLAP as well as the new tabular model in SQL Server Analysis Services in 2012. You'll look at rendering those KPIs in things like Excel, reporting services, and even performance point services. And then toward the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the do's and don'ts and some additional references. So first of all, well, what are KPIs? Well, sometimes when you talk to people about KPIs and they're just starting to work with them, the way they define them is almost indistinguishable from a standard calculation. And as we're going to see here in a minute, a KPI in itself is not the calculation. It's the evaluation of a calculation against a particular goal. Now, one example we're going to use here is one where I'm looking at an employee sales from the AdventureWorks database. So I've got employees on the left here, and I'm taking a look at their sales in the first quarter of calendar year 2007. So we see here that that Garrett had 191,000 in sales. Well, Garrett's quota, there's another database out there, another set of tables with quote information, and it's by employee and by time period was 239,000. So he's met 80% of his quota. Well, notice how we have a visualization here, and some are green, some are yellow, some are red, and even if you don't know anything about the specifics of the KPI, you probably have an idea of what's going on here. Something in green probably means good, and something in red probably means bad. But what are the rules that make up specifically what is good and what is bad? You know, Garrett's percent here is 80% of the quota. You might think, well, that's not very good, but in this sense, it's in yellow, which means either it's a warning or it's okay, depending on how the business is evaluating it. Well, then out to the right here, we've got the sales as a percent of the quota last year. So the same time period a year ago, because we're interested in knowing, you know, if we're looking at this for the first quarter of 2007, what was Garrett's percent of sales last year in quarter one of 2006? Well, it was 85%. So he's sort of trending down a little bit. This is a common scenario for KPIs. You could take a look at hundreds of KPIs across different industries, whether it's the medical industry, the construction industry, even the software industry, and all the specifics are going to differ, but the overall pattern, the mechanics are going to be pretty much the same. So this is one example that we're going to sort of decompose as we go through here. So as far as a formal definition, you could go on Wikipedia, you can go on different websites and try to look up, you know, what's a definition for a KPI. Here's my personal definition for it, and you can probably find others that are very similar. It's the measurement of an activity with respect to a goal or a baseline or some kind of standard. Now, we say activity when we're usually talking about some measured metric, whether it's sales or some other type of performance. Maybe it's the number of widgets that you sold, it's the number of answers you got right on a test, it's the measurement of some kind of activity with respect to some goal. So, you know, I got 9 out of 10 right. Well, is that good? Is that great? Is that, you know, not very good? Well, we need to evaluate with respect to some baseline, some goal. And the intent is to evaluate these across different business entities. So coming back here, we might want to look at sales with respect to a quota for individual salesmen or for a sales region or across an entire time period. We need to identify what business entities are going to be associated with this goal and which ones aren't. Now, KPIs are going to have some kind of visual component to render the measurement graphically. Now, this is something that can vary a little bit across the tools that we're using, and we'll get into that in a little while. Now, when I mentioned in one of the bullet points a few minutes ago in identifying what a KPI is and what it isn't, a measure in itself is not a KPI. There are times where I've worked with different customers over the years when they've been wanting to identify KPIs, or they've been wanting to build KPIs, and the first question is, well, you know, what types of KPIs do you have right now? And they'll say, well, we have KPI scorecards for sales dollars. And then the first question comes up is, okay, well, is that going against a quota? Or is it going against a goal of some type? And then the answer might be, well, we don't have quotas set up just yet. Well, in that case, you don't have a KPI yet. A measure in itself is not a KPI, but the evaluation of it against some kind of a baseline or standard or threshold, that's considered a KPI. Now, these can be reevaluated and reassessed over time. As a matter of fact, when you read some of the academic information about KPIs, they talk about implementing KPIs over a period of time, having the business evaluate them and possibly tweak the logic. So these, just like any other development endeavor, these are rarely static. The rules and the thresholds are going to change over time. And toward that end, the things like goals or thresholds can be data-driven. We generally don't want to hardwire the goals into an application. We want to read them out of a table of some type. Certainly the goals for 2006 for one product category are going to differ from those in 2007. Now, when you talk about KPIs, you will usually hear people at some point talk about an academic business concept known as a balanced scorecard. And this was identified, this was defined back in the 90s, back in the early 90s by two gentlemen named Kaplan and Norton. I've got a book recommendation at the end if you want to read more about the background of this. Well, they presented the concept of a balanced scorecard that represents, and this is my interpretation of it, sort of a holistic approach to KPIs within a company. Certainly when you think of KPIs initially, you think of sales with respect to a goal. Certainly every company is in business to make money, and we want to know if we're on target with respect to our goals. And so the financial perspective certainly shouldn't surprise anybody, is the top perspective amongst all KPIs. And this could be sales with respect to goals, sales trend over a prior period. Maybe we have a KPI that says that we always want our sales trend over the prior quarter to be at least X% over the prior quarter. So those are examples of financial KPIs. Another one that can be pretty common in certain industries is return percentages. I worked in the retail area for a while. The specific business doesn't matter. I worked in the retail area for a while and was on some of the weekly sales conference calls. And one of the first things that was talked about at every sales conference call, excuse me, one of the first things that was talked about was not the top sales in a region or top profit, but returns percentage. Returns are a fact of life, but they can be the bane for a lot of retailers. So we want to evaluate returns percentages against a threshold with the idea that we want to be below it. So those are financial perspectives. And Melissa, I'm going to mute here for just 1 second. Okay, back. Nothing worse than losing your voice there. Now, other types of perspectives are customer perspectives. Now, some of these might not apply that much to certain businesses, but if you have as part of the data that you collect information on customer surveys, customer evaluations, surveys of some type, with an eye towards maintaining compliance of 90% or above on customer satisfaction, you might have that as a perspective. Now, you are going to get into an area of data quality that I'll talk about in just a minute. Another type of perspective is internal business processes. I've worked in manufacturing, and so things like damages, shortages, irregulars, they're a fact of life, but you want them to be low. So you might have a scorecard that might evaluate KPIs for damages and shortages by plant, by shop, by shift, for the first shift to the second shift. That could be a very, very important type of KPI. In software shops, things like bug rate, churn rate, things like that, we might build KPIs that evaluate the work that we do. So you can have KPI scorecards for internal software companies. And then finally, you can have KPIs that evaluate learning and growth within an organization. For instance, if you're working in the government, you might be required to spend X% of time in the course of a year in training programs, and so there might be scorecards to make sure that managers are in compliance, that all their employees are spending 15% of their time at work involved in training programs. Now, there's an issue with all of these, especially the last three, and it is the validation of the data. You know that old line in the data processing industry, garbage in, garbage out. If the quality of the data isn't very good, or if there's some question as to the authenticity, or even I hate to say this, but the honesty of the data, well, then these KPIs are going to be meaningless. For instance, And I could speak from personal experience. If someone knows that they're going to get in trouble if they're not marking that they're not putting X amount of time against training programs, so they might be tempted to put information into a timesheet that might not necessarily reflect the amount of time that they actually spend in the program. It's not a very pleasant thing to talk about, but it certainly can happen. And so if there's not some kind of a validation process there, then that KPI is worthless. Also with surveys, if you have the wrong types of questions, if there's not control over the data in the surveys, well, then the surveys aren't going to be all that meaningful, and therefore the KPI won't be that meaningful. Now, with things like financial KPIs, certainly there are data quality issues or potential for issues there, but those are ones that can be identified. You can put checks in place, but checks in place for the other types of perspectives, they can be a little bit more difficult. So that's why these other perspectives, even though they're certainly important to the overall health of a company, they tend to be ones that can be difficult to manage. So just something to be aware of. Okay, going to get to the examples here in just a minute. Moving on here, I want to talk about the components of a KPI. Now, if I go back to the screenshot from a minute ago where I had the pivot table in Excel that rendered the KPI, well, you can probably guess what some of the aspects of a KPI are. Certainly the measure itself, the indicator that we're going to use, the rule that tells us what's considered good, what's considered bad, the trend. You could probably figure most of the components there. Well, if you want a formal list of the components of a KPI, first of all, we need an overall objective. It's a mission statement, just one or two sentences about what is this KPI supposed to evaluate. If you can't, that old rule, if you can't describe something, a metric or an evaluation in a couple of sentences, well, then there might be an issue there. So this might be evaluating return dollars as a percent of revenue. So if we're going to look at a return rate, evaluating return dollars as a percent of revenue, evaluating against a threshold that might vary by year and by product category. Now the metric or the measure itself, in this case, might be return dollars divided by revenue dollars expressed as a percent. So every KPI has to have a metric. Well, then it has to have a goal or a threshold to evaluate back to the measure itself. Now, in some cases, this might be a hardwired number, but more often than not, it's going to be a table that's going to store, in this case, maybe threshold rates by year and category, or whatever the granularity is going to be. Well, then we need a scoring method. Now, coming back to the screenshot here, we see that the KPI itself is either green, yellow, or red, but what are the rules when we evaluate the employee sales or whatever the KPI is going to be? What are the rules that determine what's good, what's bad, and what's in between? So we refer to this as a scoring method. So a good score might be the return percent is below the threshold for that point in time. And then an okay or a warning might be the return is maybe slightly above the threshold, maybe half a percentage point. And then a bad score means the returns percent is above the threshold and by more than half a percentage point. So we need to have a scoring method. Now, most KPIs are rendered in terms of good, bad, or somewhere in between. Not all, but most. You might see KPIs that show a gauge, or show a thermometer, or show something where you might have more than 3 states. To keep this simple, I'm going to stick to the 3-state KPIs where the evaluation is either good, bad, or somewhere in between. Well, then there's going to be a graphical display. Now, this is the default display. Certainly, other tools can override this. So, a traffic light is certainly a common one. Some people use smiley faces. Other people might actually build icons that sort of reflect the product or the corporate culture. I heard a story one time that a manufacturer of motorcycles, I'm not sure which one, actually for their internal scorecard had a picture of a little icon of a motorcycle doing a wheelie if the sales were good, and a motorcycle that was crashed if sales were bad. So certainly there can be any kind of display that you want. Now, optionally, you can have a trend rule. Now, you won't see this with every KPI, but sometimes we might want to evaluate the metric now compared with some prior time period. And an often one might be the same time period a year ago. So we might have a returns percent for one product category in one quarter of 5.5%, and last year was 4.4. So we're up compared to last year, and that's not good. We want to be low. So we might build a trend rule. And again, the trend rule is generally going to follow three states. Either we have a good trend, a bad trend, or maybe no trend with rules that evaluate, in this case, the metric now versus the same time period a year ago. Now, again, that's not required. Some KPIs will have this, some won't, but the trend rule can certainly be important if we want to see how somebody is doing over a period of time. Okay, well, now we're going to take a look at some examples. Now, not every piece of output that shows KPI style functionality is actually built from a full-blown KPI. You can build KPI style functionality into really any output. And as one example here, I'm taking a look at a reporting services report that is displaying the same information as I showed in that pivot table spreadsheet a minute ago. We get employees down the left. We've got their sales, their quota, their percent of quota. I'm going to ignore the two sparkline charts here. When this report was built, it was intended to demonstrate the sparkline capabilities in reporting services. Going to skip out here to the performance gauge out to the right. This was something that was added in Reporting Services 2008. It's a great feature that allows us to build a KPI style output that also gives us some idea of how close someone is to a goal. So as we take a look through the employees here, we've got Jillian, and Jillian's at 83% for the time period of 2007. And so we show the performance gauge here going out towards 100%. Obviously stops at 83, and we consider that in the acceptable area. So 80 to 90% is considered acceptable. And then we take a look at here David Campbell. Well, David Campbell's at 95%, so that's obviously in green. Now, I'll bring up the report here and show how, at least a little bit, how this was put together. There's also one other piece of information here. Sometimes with certain output tools, we can actually slap on some additional logic. For instance, we might pay bonuses at 85%. So the reporting services performance gauge allows us, in addition to having a goal defined with a color with a range of 0 to 80, 80 to 90, 90 to 100, we can also have another goal that we show here with a little vertical line where we pay bonuses at 85%. So back to Jillian here, she was at 83%, so that vertical line is showing in red. Then we see Linda up here at 87%, didn't hit the 90, but at least she's eligible for a bonus. So again, some tools allow us to do that. Well, how was that put together? Now I could actually spend an entire hour going over the specifics of how it's built. Don't have an hour here, but I can at least show a little bit. If I hop over here, I'm going to do a little bit of tabbing. If I hop over here to Visual Studio, and I'm going to open the project that holds this report. So here's the preview. And it's run for the year 2007, and we've got the performance gauge showing the visualization of the percent of quota. Now, again, that's using a new component in Reporting Services 2008 called a performance gauge. It's one of several new charting capabilities in 2008. Now, there are within this gauge several different options for the display of the gauge itself, the rules for coloring, the rules for that second goal of 85%. There's just too many to possibly cover here, so I don't want to get into tremendous detail. At the end of this presentation, I'm actually going to give a link to 4 videos on how this was put together. This actually takes about, from beginning to end, this report takes about 20-25 minutes to put together, and much of it is in the performance gauge. So I've got a link on how this can be built. So even if we don't build a full-blown KPI and analysis services or in other tools, we could actually have KPI style functionality with some of the presentation capabilities that are in reporting services. All right, coming back here to my slide deck. So again, we can we can put some rules for the KPI in the performance gauge. The one thing, however, is that we are embedding the logic for the KPI in the report itself, in the presentation layer, as opposed to a business layer. Somebody might look at this and say, well, okay, that's nice. That's good that you put that logic into that performance gauge, but suppose I want to build another report, and I want to use that logic, or I want to create a pivot table or a pivot chart against that data and use the logic for that. You've got your logic buried in that report, so that doesn't help me a whole lot. Well, if we store KPI in a central location, like analysis services, then we have the ability to utilize it across many, many tools. So that's a segue to the next point, and that's building a KPI in SQL Server Analysis Services using the OLAP capabilities. Now, if you haven't worked with OLAP, if you haven't built analysis services projects, I've got another link I'm going to show at the end on how you can actually get started with building OLAP cubes. But suffice to say that SQL Server Analysis Services provides capability in their OLAP engine to define KPIs in the OLAP cube that can be utilized across different applications like Excel and reporting services and so forth. Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to actually put calculations into the SSAS project itself. So if I hop back over to my virtual machine here, and bear with me one second because I am going to be doing a little bit of tabbing back and forth here. I'm going to pull up the AdventureWorks project where I beforehand built the calculations necessary to support that employee sales KPI. Well, first of all, I usually am going to need to put some calculations in before we go to the KPI area. Sometimes people jump the gun and they try to go to the KPI area without building the necessary calculations. And in this case, we need a couple of them. First of all, as I go through the list of calculations here, you're going to need one for employee sales percent itself. And that's going to be expressed simply as the reseller sales amount divided by the sales amount quota. Now, at the risk of getting too far into OLAP, there is an important point here. Someone might be saying, well, okay, but suppose you want to run that for one employee or for one time period. Don't you have to pass parameters into this? All we see here is just the core calculation. How does it know to run it for a specific employee or a specific time period or sales region or whatever? Well, that's where the beauty of OLAP comes in. That measure, reseller sales amount, and that measure for sales amount quota. If I go back to the matrix, to the dimension usage for this analysis services project, the reseller sales table is automatically sliced by the employee dimension, and the reseller sales table is also sliced by the date dimension. So we don't need to pass parameters into here. When the user is selecting an employee or a range of employees or a time period, the reseller sales will automatically be expressed in terms of those employees or those date selections because data from that reseller sales table is automatically associated with employee dimension. That in itself, it represents the beauty of analytic databases. So that's one calculation. Well, we also need one if we want to evaluate sales with respect to the same time period a year ago. So once again, I can't stress this enough. We can't jump into the KPI before we build some of the prior calculations. And so we might have the employee sales as a concept, the sales employee sales percent, expressed in terms of 1 year ago. Now here we're getting into a little bit of MDX. And so it does help to know MDX to build calculations and build KPIs in a cube. In this case, whether someone is looking at data for a quarter or a year or a month, the concept of this calculation is to go back the same time period a year ago. Well, MDX has a great calculation called parallel period that allows us to go back, in this case, 1 calendar year ago, based upon whatever date someone has selected. So that's the second calculation that we put into the cube. And then the third one, because we want to evaluate a trend of sales this year versus sales last year, we're going to have a calculation called reseller point change. and it's just simply the employee sales percent, multiplying it by 100, subtracting from that the employee sales percent last year, again multiplying that by 100 to come up with the actual point change. So coming back to my slide deck here, almost any KPI is going to require at least a handful of calculations. Some may be 1 or 2, some may be 3 or 4 or even more. It all depends upon the complexity of the KPI. Well, once we've actually identified that, then we can go forward and construct the KPI. Now, if you remember, I said back in that table a minute ago with the components of the KPI that the KPI needs to have a metric associated with it, a goal or a threshold, the scoring rules, and then optionally a trend. Well, we've got that right here. The name of the KPI here, I'll call it KPI employee sales. The value, the metric, is going to be the sales percent itself. That's that calculation from the prior slide here. Now notice how the interface actually allows you to put in a formula. If I actually go to the interface itself, if I tab back over here and go to the KPI tab and take a look at this actual KPI, for the value, it allows me to put in a formula. I don't recommend doing that. The reason that you don't want to do that is if you embed the calculation here, you might make it a little bit difficult to use that calculation in other spots. So really the recommended practice is to put any logic for the calculation of a metric back in the calculation tab and then reference it here in the value expression area. At the risk of sounding a little bit dogmatic, if it were up to me, this would be nothing but a drop down to let you refer to calculated members back in the calculations area. It's really not a good idea to put expressions in here. That's my personal opinion. Well, then we have the goal. What is considered a good employee sales percent? Now, in this instance, I've broken a rule that I usually preach, and that's not to hardwire numbers into here, to have this be an expression from another fact table. For purposes of simplicity here, I've actually got the goal in here of 0.9. But the point is that you can have a fact table that represents the goal, and that goal might vary by different business dimensions, like by quarter and by product category or sales region or whatever. Well, then we have the scoring rule and the indicator itself. Now, the drop down for the list of indicators, fairly short list, and some of the more popular ones are things like traffic lights or road signs or faces. You do have the gauge capability, but I'm going to stick with the basic ones here. Well, the scoring rule is pretty simple. With a tri-state indicator, the way we have with a traffic light here, where the values are green, yellow, red, we return one of 3 values, either 1, 0, or -1. So I've got a case statement in here that's going to evaluate the value of the KPI with respect to the goal. Now, if you're wondering, why am I using KPI value and KPI goal here? The reason is to keep this code here as generic as we possibly can. If I wind up changing the metric or changing the goal, I don't need to change this. It's not required to do it that way. It's just a convention that you'll see many people do. Well, notice how even up above I've got a case when the value of the KPI is null. If someone doesn't have sales for a particular time period, we don't want to return a garbage value or a -1 or anything like that. We just want to return a null. That way it'd be easier to suppress any rows that are empty. And then we return a 1 if the value is below the threshold. Now, in the case of a warning, if you remember coming back to the output here, I hop back a few screens. We had a couple people here at 80%, and that was in the warning area. Well, the rule here itself might be that if the value of the KPI is at least above the goal minus 10 percentage points, or 0.1, depending on how you're doing the math, then we'll return as 0. So that's our in-between area. Well, if we're not above the goal, if we're not above the goal last year, then we're obviously below the goal. In this case, that's not good, so we're returning a -1. And that again represents the core components of a KPI. Well, as I said, also we can have an optional trend. again, coming back to the example, we had Garrett here, who was at 80% this year, 85% last year, so he's trending downward. And David, who is 138%, was 101%, so he's trending upward. That's good. And we see someone like Linda here, 88% last year, 89% this year. Well, that's really no kind of significant change. Maybe we have a rule that it's got to be more than 2 percentage points to be considered a significant change. So coming back here to the trend logic, and we hit enter a couple of times to bring this up into the center of the screen, we can use the same logic. Now, once again, we want to make sure that both this year and last year are non-null. So if either this year or last year is null, then we'll return a null. If the difference between this year and last year is less than 0.02, or however you're going to handle the percentage points, then we consider that no significant change. Now, it could be a small amount upwards or downwards from last year. We don't care which one. So notice what I'm doing. I'm taking the absolute value, the difference between the two. So it doesn't matter if this year we're up by a teeny amount or we're down a teeny amount. With an absolute value, it's going to come out the same way. And then if the value is above last year, then we'll return a 1. And then anything else, we return a -1. So that's the pattern. Most KPI status and trend expressions are going to follow that type of pattern for rendering the output. So that is a KPI. Now, some KPIs are going to involve more measures, some involve more elaborate logic in the status expressions, but they're all generally going to follow this pattern. Okay, coming back to the slide deck here. So again, we name the KPI, we identify the measure to be evaluated, the goal or threshold as the case may be, how we're going to render it, the scoring rule, and then an optional trend. Now, I've got a brief mention in here. Obviously, with all the detail, can't possibly fit it into an hour, but I want to briefly mention creating KPIs in SSAS Tabular. Since the Tabular model has come about in the last 2 years, and certainly a number of people are looking at it as an alternate way to create analytic databases, it's certainly fair to show how you would implement it in the Tabular model. Well, I'm going to tab over here to an SSAS Tabular project where I've got the percent of quota, the percent of quota last year identified as calculations and as KPIs. Well, first of all, we got the calculation of the percent of quota itself. And that is going to be the sum of the reseller sales amount divided by the sum of the quota. Now, this is what's called DAX. DAX, spelled D-A-X, is the expression language that's used for the Tabular model and for Power Pivot models. It's sort of a cross. It's sort of a cross hybrid between MDX and Excel formulas. Depending upon how elaborate you're getting, it might seem more like MDX or maybe less like MDX, depending upon the complexity. But it's still doing the same concept. It's taking the reseller sales amount and dividing it by the quota. Well, we want to build a KPI off of that. Well, the Tabular model allows you to define a KPI. So if I edit the KPI settings, well, a little bit of a different interface, actually slightly more graphical, and I've got the rule here defined that that anything, in this case 85% and above is good, 75 to 85 is okay, and anything below that is not good. Now, I'm defining it with respect to a value of 1. I could have read that from a measure if I actually had another column in another table to use as a goal. Now, if we want to also implement a trend, notice how there's no trend component here with the KPI in the Tabular model. We have to actually do a little bit of additional work. It's not a huge deal, but what we have to do is build our own calculation for percent of quota last year and then build a separate KPI off of that. So instead of having one KPI with both the statistic and the evaluation for the current time period and the trend, we actually have a second KPI here that evaluates the trend with respect to last year. So you can implement the same functionality at the end of the day in SSAS Tabular. The only difference is that there's no built-in support for a trend. So you're going to have to actually calculate the change over last year as a separate measure and then build a separate KPI off of that. And then use the interface here to identify what's considered good and what's considered bad. So at the end of the day, same functionality, just implemented a little bit differently. Okay, coming back to the slide deck here. I'm going to talk about using Excel to test KPIs. After I build a KPI for a client, one of the first things I do is I hop over to Excel to test it out. Excel is a great way to test out KPIs, and as a matter of fact, some power users will they'll render KPIs in Excel. Well, I'm not going to walk through all the specifics of creating this, but if I tab back over to my virtual machine here, and I tab back over to Excel, here's the actual end product that I created. Now, what I did was I took that OLAP project and used it as a data source here in Excel. And of course, when you do that, you get the list of fact tables and dimensions, the pivot table field list. Well, I brought in the necessary measures I wanted: the reseller sales amount, the quota, the employee sales percent, and then I brought in the KPI, the KPI status. Now, I brought it in with a long name, which I changed the heading here to KPI status, but that's all I had to do. And it renders the KPI from the analysis services cube. Same thing with the trend here. Now, you do have the ability, if you go into the conditional formatting area of Excel, if you want to change, the images here. So you do have the ability, if you don't want traffic lights, if you want, again, the smiley faces or green check boxes instead of green traffic lights, you do have the ability in Excel in the dynamic formatting area to change this. Remember what's being returned. All that's being returned here from Excel, or excuse me, from the cube itself, is a value of 0 or 1, obviously you can't change that, or -1. And the same thing with the trend. Either 1, -1, or 0, that's all that's being brought back. So you have the ability to re-render that column in Excel using any set of icons that you want. So end users can certainly use Excel to consume KPIs, and as a developer, I use this all the time to test KPIs. It's a great way to do so. Now, one thing, if you're not already aware of this, you can tab back and forth between your SSAS project and Excel and refresh Excel if you want to make changes. For instance, just to demonstrate something, you wouldn't normally do this, but if I go to the KPI itself, and I'll just change the goal here. I'll make it something insanely low, like 0.5. So everybody will be good after this. I'll save it, and I'll right-click and I'll redeploy this project. And then I'll go over to Excel and refresh, and we'll see what happens. So this should deploy here in just a matter of minutes, or excuse me, just a matter of seconds. Hopefully not minutes. Well, if I come over here to Excel and I refresh everything, well, everybody's good now because I made I definitely dropped the bar there down to 50%. So this really demonstrates how well we can test out the logic of KPIs interactively here. Just redeploy the project, refresh in Excel until we get the behavior that we want. Now, I am notorious for changing things and not changing them back, and so before I go any further, let me make sure that I redeploy that again. And I'll come back to Excel and I'll refresh it again here. So come back to Excel, refresh all, and there we go. So that's how we can look at these in Excel. Now, back at the beginning, if I go back in my slide deck here, back at the beginning, I had a performance gauge in a report in reporting services where I had KPI style functionality, even though it wasn't formally a KPI. Well, the question is, if I've got a KPI in the cube and I'd like to use it in a reporting services report, is it going to be as easy as it was in Excel? Well, not quite. Here's why. I'm going to hop back over to my VM here, and I'm going to open my SSRS project. So lots of magic props here. So here's the report and reporting services that's rendering that same KPI from that same SSAS project. Now, if I go back to the dataset designer here, and I go into the query itself, if you've ever built a report against an OLAP cube or an analytic model, you know that you get a designer here where you can select the measures and you can drag and drop the dimension elements that you want, and then test the retrieval out, and it's generating an MDX query behind the scenes. Well, I also picked in this output here for the report the employee sales KPI, the goal as well as the trend. Excuse me, the status as well as the trend. But look what's showing up here, just the raw number. Well, I want the image, and all I'm getting is the raw number here. Well, fortunately, what we can do in Excel is we can actually dynamically render the image. So what I've done here in the report, first of all, notice in the report project, I've got images here for down arrow, green arrow, no change, red light, up arrow, yellow light, etc. So I've got those tiny little images that I cropped from Excel that we can use here in the report. Now in the report, I actually brought in from the toolbox, an image control. And in the image control, if I right-click on it and go to the image properties, I specified that the source of the image is an external source, and the image itself is coming from an expression. So based upon that KPI status coming back as a 1, I'm going to use the green light. Now this notation works because I've got these images in the project. And then the value 0, use a yellow light, and if it's -1, I use a red light. And the same thing for the trend. Brought in an image for the KPI trend, went to the image properties, set the image source to external, and then use the same formula capability. You have to do it this way. You can't bring in that image from the KPI automatically. Reporting services just doesn't understand it. It only brings in the numeric value from the scoring pattern, but we can obviously pick it up from there. So at the end of the day, you can still produce the same output in reporting services. Obviously, it might not look quite as clean here as Excel, but you could obviously work and make it look just as clean. So again, we need to add the images to the project. We need to add the image control or controls to the detail row, and then in the expression for the image name, we can actually evaluate the possible values for the status and then place in the name of the image. All right, now I'm going to jump slides here because I unfortunately did not combine. I had 2 different slide decks I was trying to combine beforehand for today's presentation and didn't get a chance to, so I'm going to open another slide deck here in just a second and talk about how KPIs can be rendered in performance point services. So just a quick 30-second intermission here, and I'm going to talk about the rendering of KPIs in performance point services. So I'm actually going to skip ahead a couple of slides here and talk about some content. Well, first of all, in performance point services, and I'll make sure to make these slide decks available to all the attendees. So bear with me 1 second here. Performance point services is a web dashboarding tool that it could do an entire presentation just on this. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm just going to talk about a few specifics. Performance point services allows us to render KPIs in a web dashboard page and build them in a scorecard format. So we might have multiple KPIs that we want to show that render, again, a perspective for finance or for customer surveys or whatever. Well, performance point services also allows us to not only bring in KPIs from an OLAP cube, but also create KPIs manually ourselves. Now, I talked about the fact that if you build a KPI manually within a specific output tool, well, you're tethering it to that tool and you're not making it available on the outside. But sometimes that might be necessary if maybe it's not possible to add the KPI to the project, or at least you're not able to add it right now. So that same KPI for sales with respect to a goal, we could actually build in a dashboard page and then render it for specific employees and maybe for specific time periods. Now, one of the nice capabilities of performance point services is the ability to define which dimensional data we want to display. In this case, we might pick a supervisor like Amy Alberts here and show Amy and all the people who work for Amy their sales for specific quarters or for halves of the year or whatever, the dollars, the target, and their KPI with respect to the target. So we've got the capability to build a pretty nice pivot table inside of a web dashboard page using performance point services. If anyone is interested in more specifics of how you create some of these, feel free to contact me, because performance point services, again, is a topic in itself. Now, how you would actually go through this, I've just got a few slides to briefly talk about this. We can manually create a blank KPI, change the source for the actual data and the target data. It's in this case the reseller sales amount, the sales amount quota for the actual and target values, and then the scoring pattern. So performance point services, just like all the other tools, gives us some kind of capability to build our own scoring pattern. Here in this case, anything 85 and above is good, 75 to 85 is okay, and anything below 75 is not good. And then we can actually create a scorecard and bring in one or more KPIs and ultimately create the page. Now, another thing to keep in mind, and this is, again, could be a topic for an entire conversation in itself, but one thing to keep in mind is what dimensions are going to be valid for a KPI and which ones won't. I've been talking about reseller sales and sales targets as the data for the KPI. Well, suppose someone tried to use that KPI and associate it with the product dimension. Well, there's a problem. The product dimension doesn't intersect with both of those fact tables. Product's certainly tied to reseller sales, but not to quota. So if a KPI spans multiple measures, in this case reseller sales and sales target, it's only going to be valid for those dimensions that cross with all of those fact tables. So again, the date dimension, valid to use for this. The employee dimension, valid to use for this. Sales territory, valid to use. Product, not valid. So that's always something to keep in mind. Now, jumping ahead here, another item with performance point services, and this is, in my opinion, one of the hottest features of performance point services, is the ability to create a scorecard that has multiple KPIs and then allow you to set up hot links to drill down to some additional information. So as an example here, I've got a scorecard with two KPIs, one for revenue through the reseller channel and another for revenue through the internet through the customer sales channel. So we might have two KPIs here. We're going to have two KPIs here that are tied to different sales processes where we might want to pause here for just 1 second. Okay. We might have a situation where we want to click on one KPI for one time period and see some type of report that might bear out some of the information for that KPI, and then click on another KPI and again another chart out here to the right that might give us some information that bears out for that KPI. Performance point services allows us to build the scorecard and web part approach very easily in the designer, where we can design a scorecard that has, in this case, channel revenue and internet revenue where the user selects a time period and any other related dimensions that are valid, and also allows us to take that area out to the right here and build a supporting report that's tied to the KPI. So I don't know how well this is showing over GoToMeeting in the as far as the presentation goes, but the user could click on the KPI here for Q4 of 2007 for channel revenue and maybe get the top 10 cities based upon revenue for that channel. And then they can, over here on the right-hand side, click on a time period for internet revenue and actually get the top 10 cities based upon that channel. And I've actually had clients that actually break out this part of the screen into 3 or 4 different charts. The point is that we can have supporting data, supporting grids, supporting charts that are tied to that original KPI. Again, that could be a presentation all in itself on how to construct this. And again, if anybody has questions about how to do it, feel free. The point is to be aware that these types of things are possible. Okay, coming back to my slide deck here. Just final note, and then I'll open up to questions. Just a few recommendations here at the end. First of all, you want to try not to hardwire any goals or thresholds into the KPI logic. You don't want to hardwire numbers. You want to read them out of a table. Now, when I was messing around with that 0.8, 0.9%, I was doing that for demo purposes, but really the best KPIs are ones where the data for goal or threshold is actually something's going to vary over time, and therefore we want to read it out of a table. Now, also remember, KPIs are evaluated over time. The logic can change. They're just like any other development endeavor. They're not going to be static, so you certainly don't build them once and never come back to them again. So they're just like any other part of a business metric. They're subject to change over time. Okay, when the slide deck gets sent out to everyone, I'll make sure to have some reading references. I actually have 2 different books with links that I'm going to provide, as well as I've got a couple of video links to a couple of the pieces of output that were created in here. So when I build the slide deck to Melissa, make it available for everybody, at the end of the slide deck here, there'll be some links to a couple of books, a couple of websites, and a couple of videos on how some of the content here was put together. So it's funny. We've talked about a lot here, and by the same token, we've also scratched the surface of the different types of KPIs can be built across different businesses. But really try to focus on the mechanics and the fundamentals. Once you've got those down pat, the possibilities are almost endless with what you can do with these. So, thank you for attending. I'll certainly hang around for any questions, and thanks for attending. And everybody have a good day.
All right, Kevin, we had one question earlier that was asking about, just the style of what you use for your KPIs and, challenging whether to use traffic lights or not. And I saw later in your presentation you gave some other options. Are there any others that you would suggest as far as, illustrating KPIs?
Suggestions on actually rendering them?
Or what type of visuals to use?
Oh, okay. If I come back here I'll answer it a couple of ways here. Good question. If I come back here to analysis services, so let me tab back over to my VM here. If I come back over here to analysis services, they've got a couple that are available out of the box. Just as soon as I open the project back up here. All right, if I come back over to the KPI tab, if you take a look at the status indicators that are available, again, some of these tend to be more popular than others. The ones that I've seen the most often are things like traffic lights, shapes, some people use faces, and so those are the ones that are available out of the box here in analysis services. Now, if you don't like those, depending upon the tool that you're using, you've got different options for replacing them, keeping in mind that whatever you replace it with has to follow pattern of a -1, 0, and 1. So when I was doing this in reporting services, so coming back to that project, I could have used any set of images that I wanted. And again, sometimes a company might do that. Sometimes if a company has sort of their corporate culture sort of incorporated into the project in some way, they might have their own set of images custom images that they want to use. But regardless, the pattern is going to be one where we have to map the values of 1, 0, -1 to whatever images we want to use. So that's reporting services. In Excel, if you don't like these, there is, I'm actually having a mind seizure here. I forget where it is, but there's an area within the dynamic formatting within Excel that can allow you to change these images from traffic lights to whatever you want. This is terrible. I'm forgetting where that feature is, but there's an area in Excel for conditional formatting. Actually, if you search in conditional formatting, you can find it, where you can actually change these values from traffic lights to whatever you want, again following the 1, 0, -1 notation. So it's going to vary by tool on what you're going to show. My own personal opinion is I like the traffic lights the best because they're short and sweet. Most people will say that when you build scorecards, you want to use the less is more philosophy. If you got an image that's just too big, well, then you're losing screen real estate. So I'm certainly not trying to be the presentation police and say that you should only use these, but the reason I use these as a default for clients, unless they tell me to use otherwise, is they're very small, they don't take up space, which can be very important in output, and they're pretty clear what they do.
Cool. Yeah, we'll have we're going to have a session, I think, in April or May on just pure visualization, practices. So that'll be good for the person that raised the question or others.
Sure.
Another question is, how do I get performance point services? Is it a SharePoint product, or does it come with reporting services?
Good question. Performance point services is part of SharePoint Enterprise. Starting in SharePoint 2010, performance point services became a service application within SharePoint Enterprise. So you got to have Enterprise to be able to use it, and it's the same in SharePoint 2013. So it's part of the SharePoint umbrella.
Yeah, at this point there's no additional questions.
Okay.
So I guess I'll wrap up, Kevin.
Okay.
Good? That's good.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for taking the time to help us out and present on this topic. It's we're basically, as we evolve through all the BI tools, this is a common pattern that we're going to have to apply. So it's very much appreciated. Make sure that you look for my upcoming email that will give you information about the upcoming sessions for the group. And as a new thing, once you exit the session, you'll be prompted with a survey to ask about the content of the session and also the presenter himself. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks a lot. Have a good day, everybody.